1856, Mississippi. The Bell family stood at the top of local society, celebrated for their grand estate, lavish parties and endless fields of cotton that made them one of the wealthiest names in the South. Neighbors envied their fortune, businessmen praised their influence, and even local authorities seemed eager to protect their pristine reputation. But behind that carefully polished image was a nightmare no one wanted to see. For years, whispers circulated about the Bell property, rumors of workers who vanished without explanation, of muffled cries at night, of bribes slipped into the hands of sheriffs to make uncomfortable questions disappear. Some claimed the family had a private punishment system to discipline those who stepped out of line, but most were too frightened to speak up. It wasn't until a traveling merchant, noticing a foul stench near an old wooden shed behind the main house, dared to investigate that the ugly truth began to unravel. Inside he found 12 men chained to iron posts, starved to skin and bones, their wrists raw and infected, some too weak to lift their heads, others already dead, eyes open in a hollow, final plea for mercy. The discovery shocked the region, but what followed was even more disturbing. A town so invested in the Bell family's prosperity that many still tried to cover up the crime, downplay the horror, and preserve the illusion of Southern grace. This is the story of how one family's greed, cruelty, and obsession with power turned their plantation into a graveyard of broken human lives. Stay with us until the end, because once you know what really happened inside that shed, you'll understand why the Bell name is still spoken in hushed tones. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the darkest sides of history, so you're always the first to uncover what others tried to hide. Chapter 1. The Bell family's perfect image. The Bell family had everything money could buy. Their estate stretched across hundreds of acres of fertile Mississippi land, dotted with rows of cotton so white it looked like snowfall under the sun. Dozens of workers labored from dawn until the moon rose, all under the silent watch of hired overseers who carried whips tucked casually at their belts. Local merchants depended on the Bells. Judges attended their dinners. The church praised them for uplifting the community, with donations that paid for stained glass windows and shiny new pews. To most outsiders, the Bells were the pride of Jefferson County, a shining example of Southern aristocracy. Jonathan Bell, the patriarch, was a man who understood the art of appearances. He hosted elegant parties every season, where guests traveled miles just to marvel at his home's grand columns, the crystal chandeliers imported from Europe, the silver laid perfectly on long mahogany tables. His wife Eleanor was known for her fine taste and charitable gestures. She organized fundraising teas for widows of war veterans, paid school fees for children whose fathers worked on their land, and always made sure to be seen kneeling at the front of the church on Sundays. They smiled for every guest, offered sweet tea on the veranda, and made sure no one ever suspected the darkness hidden just beyond the manicured lawns. But whispers found a way to slip through the cracks. They started as little comments. A merchant mentioning he saw Bell's overseer buying chains in bulk, a midwife confiding that workers she tended to suddenly disappeared after injuries that should have kept them bedridden for weeks. There were quiet questions about why the Bell property always seemed to need new hands, when neighboring plantations managed with far fewer. Inside the house, things were even stranger. Servants spoke in hushed tones of locked rooms they were never allowed to enter. They'd find small bloodstains on linens that were quickly burned. Once, a housemaid named Clara claimed she opened a parlor cabinet to put away polished silver and found a ledger filled not with sales or crop tallies, but with pages of names, dates, and unsettling notes like, tested, unfit, relocated. She tried to show it to the cook, but the next morning the book was gone, replaced with a harmless guest list for an upcoming summer ball. Clara never spoke of it again. Months later she too was gone, supposedly returned to her family up north, though no one ever received a letter or farewell. Out in the fields, the atmosphere grew tenser with each passing season. Overseers were more aggressive, quick to punish even small mistakes. Workers became noticeably thinner, bruises common, eyes sunken from exhaustion and fear. Some of the older hands, men and women who'd worked there for years, told frightening tales of a shed behind the orchard, an old wooden structure with iron hinges and a heavy lock. They said you could hear cries at night coming from inside, low moans that stopped abruptly as if someone covered mouths or worse. A few men claimed they saw Jonathan himself dragging workers across the grass by lantern light, headed straight for that building, only to return alone hours later. The community's response was always the same. Deny. Ignore. Explain it away. The Bells were too important to fail. Local businesses thrived on their money. The church needed their tithes. The sheriff owed his position to donations that padded his campaign fund. Whenever a whisper grew too loud, it was quickly silenced by payments or threats. After all, who wanted to challenge a family with enough influence to ruin your livelihood overnight? But the rumors didn't stop completely. They were like rot under paint, always threatening to burst through. A schoolteacher once remarked that Eleanor Bell ordered strange herbs from out of state, known more for ritual use than medicine. A stable hand swore he saw her in the dead of night walking barefoot across the grass, whispering to the ground. Even if these stories sounded like drunken exaggerations, they stuck. People began crossing the street when they saw a Bell carriage approaching. Tradesmen delivered goods quickly, heads down, hoping to be on their way before anything could happen. Meanwhile, inside the Bell household, life went on like a lavish performance. Music filled the drawing rooms, polished shoes danced across marble floors, and laughter rang out during dinners piled high with roasted meats and imported wine. Visitors left commenting on how generous and refined the Bells were, how lucky Jefferson County was to have such patrons. No one asked about the missing workers. No one wondered why a shipment of new chains arrived every year, even though the plantation already had more equipment than it could ever use. No one pressed when a sobbing mother came looking for her son, who had been sent to Bell's plantation and never returned. Because confronting the Bells meant confronting the entire rotten structure that kept Jefferson County prosperous. And that was something few were willing to risk. But all of this, the fancy dinners, the donations, the careful smiles, was nothing more than a fragile mask. Beneath it, the truth was clawing to get out. All it needed was the right moment, the right pair of eyes willing to look where no one else dared. And that moment was coming faster than the Bells could ever prepare for. Workers on nearby plantations began to notice how the Bell wagons were seen more often at distant markets, hauling goods that didn't always match the season's yields. Some suspected the Bells were involved in trading more than just cotton, moving people as quietly as livestock, covering tracks with forged documents and bribes. Whenever the gossip grew too loud, the Bells responded with more grand parties, more generous donations to the church, and carefully staged appearances at county fairs. It was a well-rehearsed routine that never failed to redirect attention. But the workers on the Bell estate had no illusions. They knew exactly what was happening, even if fear kept them from speaking. One evening, an older field hand named Moses confided to a boy no older than 14 that he'd seen things in the shed that he would never forget. Men chained so tightly their skin broke under iron cuffs, forced to kneel for hours without water. Some were gagged with dirty rags, eyes wide with panic. Moses told him, "It ain't a place meant to hold tools, son. It's a place meant to break men." The boy never repeated the story, terrified that even sharing it would put a target on his back. Meanwhile, the Bell children, 3 boys and a girl, grew up surrounded by luxury, attending private tutors and learning the art of manipulation by watching their parents. The oldest, Robert, took particular interest in the running of the plantation. By the age of 17 he was already giving orders to overseers, his voice hard and impatient. Some workers whispered that Robert was even crueler than his father, enjoying the power of watching men flinch at his commands. Once, after a minor theft, he allegedly ordered a worker whipped until he couldn't stand. The body was later removed at night and never seen again. This quiet reign of terror was so woven into daily life that most accepted it as simply how things were. The Bells were rich, powerful, untouchable. The workers were replaceable. Those who tried to run rarely got far. Dogs trained to hunt humans patrolled the edges of the estate, and overseers on horseback delighted in chasing down anyone desperate enough to flee. Some who were caught disappeared into that shed and were never seen alive again. Yet for all their control, cracks were forming. A traveling merchant named Elias Grady began to visit Jefferson County regularly, buying cotton to ship north. Unlike local businessmen, he didn't owe his fortune to the Bells. On one of his deliveries, he noticed something strange, a sour, rotting odor coming from the rear of the Bell property. Curious, and perhaps reckless, he followed the smell one afternoon, finding himself near the infamous shed. The door was closed and locked, but as he leaned closer, he heard a faint noise that made his blood run cold. It was a groan, low and painful, followed by a rattling of chains. Elias left immediately, heart pounding, but the sound haunted him. He mentioned it to a pair of other traders over drinks that night. They laughed it off at first, suggesting maybe it was injured livestock. But Elias wasn't convinced. The next time he visited the Bells to finalize a purchase, he tried to edge closer to the shed again. This time a pair of overseers blocked his path. They smiled politely, offered to escort him back to the main house, and made it very clear, without ever raising their voices, that visitors didn't wander beyond the fields without permission. Stories like this began to spread beyond Jefferson County. Merchants, preachers, even traveling performers spoke of the strange hospitality at the Bell estate, how it felt forced, hollow, like something monstrous was being carefully hidden. But still, the Bell's influence was strong enough that most people dismissed these tales as local superstition or petty envy of a powerful family. No one wanted to believe that the people who donated the new church bell and funded the county's first library could be monsters. It was easier to keep attending their parties, to drink their wine and praise their generosity, than to admit something was deeply wrong. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how many hands try to keep it buried. And soon, an unexpected witness would force the horrors of the Bell family into the open, shattering their perfect illusion forever. Chapter 2: The Whispers Turned to Screams. It started with little things that even the most loyal overseers couldn't hide. More workers vanished without any records of them being sold or transferred. Families came to the Bell estate asking about husbands, brothers, sons who had been sent there to work and stopped sending letters home. The Bells always had excuses. They claimed a worker had run off in the night, or had been sent to another plantation downriver, or died of fever and was buried quickly to stop the spread of disease. There were no death certificates, no witnesses, only polite but firm reassurances from Jonathan Bell himself, who offered small payments to grieving families to soothe their losses. But grief doesn't listen to money for long. Rumors started to swirl louder through Jefferson County, carried by field hands moving between plantations, by merchants who spent just enough time on Bell land to notice the haunted looks of the workers. Even other plantation owners began to whisper behind the Bells' backs, worried that if the stories grew too loud, attention might spread to their own operations. The workers on the Bell estate lived in a state of quiet dread. At night, some would lie awake, straining to hear sounds from the shed that had become the center of every dark tale. Those who worked closest to the orchards claimed they heard cries and rattling chains after the sun went down. Others swore they saw shadows moving between the cracks of the old wood walls, heard pleading voices cut off by harsh commands in Jonathan's voice. One night it got worse. A young man named Caleb, barely 20, was caught hiding behind a stack of crates near the shed. He'd been trying to see if the stories were true, if there really were people inside. When the overseers found him, they dragged him to the main yard and forced every worker on the property to watch as Robert Bell himself beat him until he stopped moving. The next morning, Caleb's body was gone. No grave. No explanation. Just gone. The message was clear: curiosity would not be tolerated. But fear only worked for so long. As more people disappeared, desperation began to eclipse caution. A group of workers decided they couldn't wait to be the next to vanish. Under the cover of darkness, they tried to slip away through the cotton fields, hoping to reach a neighboring property and beg for protection. They never made it. Dogs picked up their scent before they reached the boundary fence. Overseers rode them down like game. The next day no one saw the men again. The overseers claimed they were sent away as punishment to work on harsher lands in Alabama. Everyone else suspected they were locked inside the shed, or already dead. Meanwhile, the Bells carried on with their lives as if nothing had changed. Eleanor planned a lavish autumn banquet, sending invitations to wealthy families across 3 counties. Musicians were hired, new silk drapes were hung, and the house was filled with the scent of imported flowers. Guests arrived in carriages, dazzled by the estate's opulence, too busy drinking and dancing to wonder why so many new faces had disappeared from the fields. It was during this banquet that everything finally began to unravel. Elias Grady, the merchant who'd once heard the groans by the shed, was invited to negotiate a special contract. He arrived at the party with polite smiles but a suspicious mind. Late into the night, emboldened by wine and fed up with the Bells' smug superiority, he decided to slip away from the lantern-lit porch and walk the grounds alone. He headed straight for the shed. This time there were no overseers conveniently waiting. The party had most of the staff distracted, busy serving trays of roast quail and pouring glasses of French wine. Elias approached the shed and was immediately hit by the overpowering stench of rot. He tried the latch. To his surprise, it was unlocked. Slowly he pulled the door open. What he found would burn itself into his memory for the rest of his life. Inside, 12 men were chained to iron rings set deep into the ground. Their ankles and wrists were raw and swollen, crusted with dried blood. Some lifted their heads weakly at the sudden light, eyes sunken, cheeks hollow from starvation. Others didn't move at all. Elias stepped forward and realized 2 of them were dead, bodies already stiff, the smell so strong it turned his stomach. One of the living men tried to speak, his voice a raspy whisper. "Help us, please." The words broke off into a cough that sprayed flecks of dark blood onto the dirt floor. Elias staggered back, horror clawing up his spine. He ran from the shed, almost colliding with two guests laughing as they stumbled toward the orchards for a drunken stroll. He didn't stop to warn them. He went straight to his carriage, ordered the driver to leave at once, and by dawn he was in the county seat, demanding to speak with the sheriff. The sheriff was a friend to the Bells, a man who owed much of his office to their donations, but even he couldn't ignore the look on Elias's face or the smell that still clung to his coat. Reluctantly, the sheriff gathered a small group of deputies and rode out to the Bell estate. When they arrived, Jonathan greeted them with his usual charm, pretending ignorance, insisting there must be some misunderstanding. Eleanor stood beside him, face carefully blank, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. But it was too late for performances. Elias led the men straight to the shed. The deputies didn't need to be convinced. The door was still slightly ajar. Inside, the sight was worse than before. Overnight, one more man had died, his body slumped against another prisoner who was too weak to push him away. The deputies cut the chains and began to carry the survivors out into the morning sun. Some screamed at the sudden brightness. Others sobbed uncontrollably, clutching the hems of deputies' coats as if terrified they'd be dragged back inside. One man's legs were so ruined by infection that when they tried to help him stand, his skin split open, drawing fresh blood. Elias stood to the side, hands shaking. He had come for business, hoping to secure a lucrative cotton deal. Instead, he uncovered a nightmare that would shake Jefferson County for decades. The Bells tried everything to contain the disaster. Jonathan offered money on the spot, thick stacks of bills pulled from a hidden drawer in his office, pressed urgently into the sheriff's hands. Eleanor promised donations to the church that would build an entire new wing, swore they'd finance a library in the sheriff's own name. But the deputies weren't blind. Some of them had grown up in the same county, new families who had been searching for missing sons. Standing there with the stench of the shed clinging to their uniforms, watching emaciated men sob and whisper prayers of thanks for being freed, no amount of money could wash it away. Word spread fast. By evening, riders were galloping down dusty roads, carrying news to every corner of Jefferson County and beyond. Small groups gathered outside general stores and saloons, whispering in stunned horror. Mothers who'd lost sons to mysterious contracts, with the Bells fell to their knees when they heard what had been found, wailing into the dirt roads. Other plantation owners turned pale, realizing if the Bells could fall, maybe they weren't as untouchable as they believed. Meanwhile, Jonathan locked himself in his study, trying desperately to draft letters to allies, judges, bankers, politicians, hoping to keep the worst from happening. But for the first time, the Bell name wasn't opening doors. No one wanted to be tied to a scandal involving chained workers starving to death in a shed. Neighbors who once eagerly attended Bell parties now refused to answer calls, afraid to even be seen near the property. Eleanor paced the upstairs halls, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped a vase. Servants avoided her eyes, scurrying down back staircases. The house was no longer the buzzing hive of polite society, it had turned into a tomb of whispers and locked doors. The sheriff returned the next morning with more men, this time armed with official papers to seize records, search the entire estate, and take statements from anyone who lived or worked there. The Bells tried to delay, claiming illness, trying to buy time to destroy ledgers or hide evidence. But the deputies pushed past them, ransacking the offices and storerooms. What they found was worse than anyone imagined. In a locked cabinet behind Jonathan's desk, they uncovered a thick ledger bound in dark leather. Page after page listed names, ages, where each worker had come from, alongside chilling notes in Jonathan's careful script. Uncooperative, isolated, likely to run, confine, condition deteriorating, disposal to be arranged. It was evidence that these weren't random acts of cruelty. It was systematic, planned, managed like a business. Eleanor tried to snatch the ledger from the deputies, screaming that it was private family accounting, but they shoved her back, pocketing it as evidence. More searches turned up blood-stained ropes, heavy chains caked with old rust and something darker, piles of soiled rags that still stank of sweat and sickness. In one locked storage trunk they found personal effects, small wooden crosses, a torn bonnet, a letter from a mother asking her son to come home soon. Proof that these were not just laborers, but sons and brothers who had been swallowed by the Bell estate. By the time the sun set on that second day, the Bells were under formal arrest. Deputies carted off boxes of ledgers, receipts, and household logs. Workers watched silently from the fields as their powerful owners were led away in irons, the same kind they'd used to bind others. Some couldn't believe it even then. A few older laborers collapsed to their knees, sobbing in shock. Others simply stared, blank-faced, too hollowed by years of fear to process what justice might look like. News traveled fast beyond Mississippi. Newspapers in New Orleans, Savannah, even as far as New York, ran lurid headlines about the horrors uncovered on the Bell plantation. They printed sketches of the shed with dark figures chained inside, portraits of Jonathan and Eleanor looking stiff and regal, captioned with words like, "Monsters hiding behind Southern gentility." The Bell fortune began to evaporate overnight. Banks called in debts. Business partners cut ties. Old friends refused to answer letters. And yet, for all the public outrage, there were still whispers in private rooms, that the Bells had only been caught because they pushed too far, too openly. That other plantations might be guilty of the same crimes, only better at hiding them. Some plantation owners paid for quiet investigations of their own properties, terrified the next scandal would land on their doorstep. Back on the Bell estate, the shed stood empty at last. Deputies removed the chains, burned the filthy bedding and boarded the doors. But even stripped of its horrors, the building seemed to exude a rotting malevolence. Workers still avoided it, crossing themselves, muttering that you could almost hear faint rattles at night if you dared walk too close. And though the Bells were gone, carted off to face trial, the scars they left behind wouldn't heal so easily. The community that once praised their generosity was now forced to reckon with the reality that they'd been complicit, through silence, through trade, through every handshake and polite dinner where no one asked hard questions. The Bell family's perfect image was shattered forever, replaced by something grotesque and unforgettable. And Jefferson County would never be the same. Chapter 3, The Fall of the Bells. The Bells were taken under heavy guard to the county seat, where the courthouse steps overflowed with onlookers. Some came out of genuine outrage, others for the thrill of seeing the mighty humiliated. Vendors even showed up selling pies and cider to the gawking crowds, turning the scandal into a twisted public fair. Jonathan Bell tried to maintain his usual composure, but it slipped the moment he was forced out of the wagon in chains. His face twitched, his eyes darted around, searching for a friendly nod or a hand outstretched in support. There were none. Eleanor walked beside him, stiff as marble, clutching a handkerchief to her lips. She refused to look at anyone, as if pretending not to see the crowd could erase the reality of her disgrace. Inside the courthouse, the proceedings began almost immediately. The prosecutor laid out the case with brutal efficiency. Ledgers meticulously documenting the imprisonment of workers, financial records showing payments to the sheriff to overlook missing persons reports, and sworn statements from survivors describing being beaten, starved, and chained for months. The most damning testimony came from the men found inside the shed. Even half recovered, their bodies were living proof of what the Bells had done. When one survivor rolled up his sleeve to reveal deep scars that circled his wrist like bracelets of rot, the jury members visibly recoiled. Local elites who once toasted the Bells now squirmed in the gallery, afraid that their own dealings might come under scrutiny. Some had bought cotton directly from the Bells, some had hosted them in their own parlors, praising their philanthropy without ever asking what funded such lavish donations. The scandal was so explosive it threatened to drag half the county's reputation down with it. As days turned to weeks, more evidence surfaced. Letters written by Eleanor to suppliers in New Orleans, casually requesting additional shackles, were read aloud in court. Receipts for bulk shipments of lime, likely used to cover decomposition odors, were shown to jurors. The ledgers became almost like a grotesque diary of cruelty, coldly listing human beings as liabilities or assets, recording punishments as though they were mere maintenance costs. Jonathan tried to claim ignorance, suggesting the overseers acted on their own, that he had entrusted daily operations to managers who abused his trust. But the neat columns in his own handwriting destroyed that lie. Eleanor was even more transparent in her guilt. One page of the ledger included her initials next to chilling notes about isolating troublemakers. The courtroom went silent when a prosecutor asked her directly if she had ever visited the shed. Her thin lips pressed together, but she didn't deny it. Meanwhile, back in Jefferson County, the Bell estate deteriorated almost overnight. Without the iron grip of Jonathan or the cold oversight of Eleanor, the plantation fell into disarray. Overseers fled, fearing prosecution. Workers simply walked off the land, many too traumatized to even pack belongings. The once perfectly pruned hedges wilted. Windows broke under storm winds with no one to repair them. Stray dogs moved into the abandoned slave quarters, howling at night, unsettling anyone who passed by. Merchants who had once counted on the Bell fortune for steady profits scrambled to adjust. Banks initiated foreclosures on Bell properties to salvage what money they could, but many buyers were hesitant to touch the land, whispering it was cursed. Even local clergy struggled with their sermons, how to explain that for years they had praised a family now exposed as monsters. The trials drew curious spectators from other states. Reporters packed into the gallery, scribbling every gasp and revelation into columns that would soon appear under lurid headlines. Papers from New York to Charleston ran stories about the Mississippi House of Chains. Sketch artists drew haunting images of emaciated men and the cold, unblinking faces of the Bells as they listened to their crimes catalogued in open court. Under all this pressure, some of the Bell children, once so smug in their inherited power, began to crack. Robert, the eldest son, was arrested separately after a former overseer came forward to testify that Robert personally ordered beatings and once bragged about breaking men's spirits like you break a horse. In his first court appearance, Robert lashed out, screaming that it was all lies, that his family was the backbone of Jefferson County, that without them the whole region would collapse. But even his outburst only served to remind everyone how easily cruelty poured out of the Bell lineage. One by one the Bells were sentenced. Jonathan and Eleanor received the harshest penalties, found guilty of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and murder by neglect. Robert faced charges for assault and torture, while his siblings, though less directly implicated, were shunned, their future prospects ruined by the family name. The Bells, who once dreamed of expanding their empire into neighboring states, would instead spend the remainder of their lives behind bars, their fortunes dismantled piece by piece. But punishment in court did little to ease the horror left behind. Survivors struggled with permanent injuries. Some walked with twisted limbs, others could no longer use their hands properly because of nerve damage from the chains. Many carried nightmares that would haunt them long after the Bells were locked away. Local families who had quietly accepted Bell money now faced shame and whispers themselves, forced to confront how easily they had traded silence for prosperity. As the months passed, the once great Bell plantation became a symbol of everything rotten about unchecked power and greed. Children dared each other to run up to the shed doors and knock, swearing you could still hear faint rattles from inside. Former guests at Bell parties burned invitations they'd once proudly displayed on mantels, hoping to distance themselves from the family's disgrace. Even the church, so eager for Bell donations, tried to erase plaques and dedications that carried their name. But memory is harder to scrub clean than stone. Generations later, older residents would still lower their voices when speaking about the Bells, saying it was a lesson carved into the very soil of Jefferson County. Never trust a family too eager to appear generous, because behind that kindness might lurk chains you can't see, until it's far too late. In the wake of the trial, Jefferson County tried to return to normal, but the stain left by the Bells was too deep. Wealthy families who had once competed for invitations to the Bell estate found themselves under discreet investigation. Some quietly hired men to burn old ledgers or retire overseers who knew too much, hoping to prevent similar accusations from surfacing on their own properties. Meanwhile, survivors of the Bell shed were scattered. Some received small compensations arranged by church groups desperate to clean their hands of guilt. A few moved north, trying to escape the memory of Mississippi altogether. But most were too poor, too physically damaged to start over anywhere else. They remained in nearby towns, haunted by nightmares of iron cuffs and dark, suffocating spaces. Neighbors offered awkward sympathy but also fear. Many believed the survivors brought a sort of lingering curse with them, a living reminder of what polite society had allowed to happen. Newspapers continued to feed the national appetite for the scandal. Serialized stories exaggerated certain details, inventing ghostly figures seen in the Bell attic, or claiming Eleanor Bell practiced black magic to keep her property fertile. Though most of these tales were nothing but morbid fantasy, they cemented the Bell legacy in American folklore. For people far from Mississippi, it became a kind of grim entertainment, cautionary and thrilling. For Jefferson County, it was a wound that wouldn't close. The sheriff who had long ignored complaints about the Bells tried to salvage his own reputation by zealously pursuing other plantation owners for any hint of wrongdoing. Some cheered, believing at last there might be real justice. Others saw it for what it was, an opportunist trying to save his own neck now that public opinion had turned. Regardless of motive, more properties faced sudden inspections, ledgers were seized, and a few smaller estates were quietly sold off before investigations could dig too deep. Eleanor and Jonathan, meanwhile, languished in separate prison cells hundreds of miles from the lush verandas and ballroom they once ruled. Jonathan's health deteriorated rapidly. Within 2 years he died in a cold cot, without servants or fine bourbon, no doctor's bribe to ease his pain. His last days were spent writing frantic letters to judges who ignored him. Eleanor survived much longer, isolated and despised even by other inmates. Guards sometimes reported hearing her muttering to herself, reciting guest lists from old parties as if trying to rebuild the shattered illusion of her former life. When she finally died, there was no ceremony, no family carriage to collect her body, only a plain wooden box buried behind prison walls. Robert fared even worse. His violent temper made him a target among hardened criminals, and stories filtered back to Jefferson County that he was repeatedly beaten, robbed of what little he owned, and left a broken figure. The rest of the Bell children faded into obscurity. Unable to reclaim any part of the family fortune, they lived out their days under assumed names, trying to outrun a history that followed them wherever they went. Meanwhile, the Bell estate itself fell into ruin. Weeds overtook the gardens where Eleanor once held elegant teas. The grand house cracked under years of storms and neglect. Local boys dared each other to sneak inside, carving initials into dusty banisters and daring each other to spend a night in the abandoned parlors. The shed where 12 men had been found shackled rotted so badly that the roof finally collapsed. Some argued it should have been torn down long before, but others insisted it was better to leave it standing, as a reminder, grim and undeniable, of what the Bells had done. Eventually, ownership of the land changed hands several times. Investors hoped to revive the cotton business but struggled to keep workers, who quit after claiming to hear chains rattling at night or faint cries near the old orchard. A few who tried to tear down what was left of the shed reported tools breaking unexpectedly, or accidents that left them with shattered bones. Whether it was guilty conscience, superstition, or something darker, no one could say for sure. By the end of the decade, the Bell plantation was a ghost story more than a working farm. Travelers avoided the old roads that ran past it. Children who grew up hearing tales of the Bells learned to keep their distance, even as adults, crossing themselves or touching charms in their pockets when forced to ride nearby. In court ledgers, in old newspaper archives, the facts remained stark. A family who built their empire on brutality, who chained human beings like animals, who bribed sheriffs and bought silence, until greed pushed them so far the truth finally exploded into daylight. But outside dusty records, in the hearts of the people of Jefferson County, the Bells lived on not as cautionary history but as whispered warnings, proof that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears fine clothes, smiles sweetly on a church pew, and invites you in for tea. Chapter 4: What Lingered After the Chains. Long after the Bells were dead or scattered, Jefferson County struggled to scrub the family's memory from its conscience. The courthouse archives still held the ledgers and testimonies from the trial, tucked into boxes no one liked to pull out. Schoolchildren learned a polite version of local history that carefully avoided details of the shed, focusing instead on how cotton once built the region's prosperity. But outside classrooms, the truth survived in low voices, in warnings mothers gave their children when they strayed too close to the old Bell roads. Some tried to move on by reinventing the land. Investors from out of state arrived with plans to resurrect the plantation. They ordered repairs on the main house, hired overseers to prepare new rows of cotton, hoping to build a sanitized, profitable version of what the Bells left behind. But their projects never lasted. Workers refused to stay overnight. Tools went missing or turned up twisted and broken. One foreman quit on the spot after swearing he saw a line of shadowy figures chained together near the orchard, walking in slow jerks before vanishing behind the rotten shed walls. Those who stayed longer complained of nightmares so vivid they woke with bruises around their wrists, or of hearing chains dragging across their floorboards at night. A few were found packed and ready to leave in the middle of the night, unable to explain exactly what had driven them off, only that they couldn't take the sounds anymore. Meanwhile, local preachers attempted to reclaim the ground with prayer gatherings. They led him circles through the fields, sprinkled holy water on the cracked porch of the Bell house, and nailed small wooden crosses to the shed's splintering boards. For a time it seemed to help. No new accidents, no strange reports. But as months passed, the crosses fell one by one, sometimes ripped straight out as if something inside didn't want to be pinned down. By the 1880s, the estate was little more than a ruin. The once grand Bell mansion stood hollow and picked over by scavengers. Windows were smashed, doors hung loose from rusted hinges, and ivy clawed up the walls like it was trying to choke the house into dust. The roof of the shed finally caved entirely, leaving behind rotted beams and broken chains half buried in weeds. No one bothered to clear it. Farmers plowed around the old Bell property, leaving it as an island of dark memory in a sea of fresh cotton rows. Stories clung to the place regardless. Young lovers who walked too close after dark claimed to hear whispers begging for water. Hunters swore they saw figures crouched near the remains of the shed, only to find nothing when they approached, save for deep impressions in the dirt, shaped like knees and elbows as if someone had been crawling there for hours. Children dared each other to run up and touch the splintered wood. Some came back crying, unable to explain why they felt hands grab at their ankles when nothing was there. Occasionally, strangers, journalists, amateur historians, even spiritualists, came hoping to document the infamous Bell grounds. They poked through debris, scribbled notes about atmospheric pressure shifts, snapped photographs that sometimes developed with smudged streaks that resembled shackled limbs. But none stayed long. Even the boldest left with hollow eyes, often refusing to ever set foot on Mississippi soil again. The surviving families of the men found chained in the shed carried the deepest scars. Some tried to build new lives in neighboring towns, but the Bell name followed them, a stain that bred pity and suspicion in equal measure. Grandchildren of the survivors grew up hearing stories of their ancestors' captivity, nightmares that crossed generations. For them, the Bell estate was more than local folklore, it was a family wound that never truly closed. Decades after the trial, elderly residents of Jefferson County still lowered their voices when speaking of the Bells. At town socials, someone might let slip a comment about how they once attended a party at the Bell house as a child, only to quickly change the subject, eyes darting as if afraid the walls themselves might overhear. Others confessed they felt guilty for not asking more questions back then, for enjoying the Bells' wine and polite company while people starved behind locked doors just a few yards away. By the early 1900s, the county began to embrace the story in a twisted way, offering ghost tours that guided curious tourists past the rotting foundations. Guides recited half-true tales of Eleanor Bell dancing barefoot in blood or Jonathan forging contracts with the devil to keep his cotton fields alive. The truth, that greed and power alone were enough to produce such horror without any help from demons, seemed too mundane, too uncomfortable to face. Visitors wanted monsters, curses, evil spirits. Few wanted to grapple with how easily ordinary people could become complicit in atrocities if the profits were good enough. Meanwhile, the shed, or what was left of it, became the centerpiece of every story. Even reduced to a pile of rotting wood and rusted chain links, it radiated unease. Locals sometimes found small offerings there: wilted flowers, crude crosses carved from sticks, even notes scrawled on scraps of cloth asking forgiveness from the men who had died in chains. It was as if the county was still trying to apologize, generation after generation, for ever letting the Bell's power grow unchecked. In the end, the Bell legacy was not preserved in grand ledgers or family portraits hanging proudly in a gallery. It lived on in the nervous glances of farmers who sped up their horses near the property line, in the quiet horror passed down at kitchen tables when elders finally confessed what they had seen or heard in their youth. It existed in the empty fields where cotton once grew thick and white under the sun, now patchy and untended, because no one wanted to risk the land, or whatever still lingered beneath it. Even after generations, the Bell land couldn't completely shake off its past. By the mid-20th century, most people in Jefferson County avoided talking about it outright. If you pressed older residents, they'd look down, pick at their fingernails, or shift uncomfortably in their chairs. A few might mutter a clipped warning, "It's best left alone." Still, stories slipped through. A local mail carrier in the 1940s reported hearing chains dragging behind him as he crossed the edge of the old Bell property. He turned, half expecting to find children playing a prank, but saw only empty fields and a wind that carried the faintest scent of rot. Years later, he'd tell his grandson that was the moment he decided never to take a route that passed the estate again, even if it cost him extra hours each week. By the 1970s, paranormal enthusiasts began arriving with tape recorders and infrared cameras, hoping to capture proof of something supernatural. Some returned with garbled audio full of clicks and faint sobs. Others claimed they picked up shadowy figures on film that disappeared the moment they tried to focus. Most left with nothing except a heavy feeling that clung to them long after they drove away. Locals said that was the land's way of making sure no one forgot what had happened there. Meanwhile, descendants of the Bell family, living under changed surnames and scattered across other states, quietly fought to distance themselves from the legacy. A handful tried to challenge old records, even paying lawyers to contest newspaper accounts and court transcripts. But the evidence was overwhelming. Too many ledgers, too many official testimonies, too many graves. It was a stain they couldn't scrub away with money or new identities. When confronted, some admitted their ancestry in ashamed whispers, terrified it might define them forever. Occasionally, distant relatives dared to visit Jefferson County, hoping to see what remained of the estate. They'd stand on the cracked foundations of the old Bell mansion, staring at broken bricks tangled with weeds, trying to reconcile family lore with the stark horror of what was left behind. Most didn't stay long. They'd leave wreaths or small wooden crosses near the shed's collapsed remains before driving off, as if hoping a token gesture could ease generations of guilt. Through it all, the people of Jefferson County continued to live with the uneasy knowledge that their prosperity had once been rooted in blood and chains. Families whose grandparents attended bell parties kept their silence, while children whispered horror stories at sleepovers, daring each other to run down Old Bell Road at night. Some swore if you did, you'd hear begging voices trailing just behind you, calling out names no one had spoken aloud in a century. In court records and archived newspapers, the details stayed cold and factual. Indictments, witness statements, prison sentences. But in living memory, the story morphed into something more haunting, a communal sin that never fully washed away. The shed where 12 men were found chained became a symbol of every ignored warning, every polite smile that covered up horror, every dollar that bought silence. And so, the Bell name remained spoken only in lowered voices. Not as a piece of family history, or a faded grandeur to be nostalgically mourned, but as a grim lesson. Proof that cruelty can thrive behind wealth and manners, and that when a community chooses comfort over truth, it builds its own prison, one that can last for generations. Chapter 5. The Weight of Memory. Long after the last Bell died in prison, the descendants of the men who had once been chained in that dark shed continued to carry scars that weren't visible on skin. For many families, the story of what happened at the Bell estate became an unspoken shadow that shaped how they saw the world, how they raised their children, how they trusted, or didn't trust, the powerful who still ruled local politics. Some families tried to bury the memory entirely. They avoided talking about ancestors who had worked for the Bells, afraid it would brand them forever as descendants of victims. Grandparents told children only that their forefathers left the old plantations without explaining why. Old Bibles had names scratched out on family pages, as if even written reminders of that generation were too painful to keep. Yet for all these efforts to silence the past, it found ways to bleed through. A mother would flinch at the sound of chains rattling on a neighbor's gate. A father would grow cold when asked why he refused to work land once owned by the Bells, offering only, "Nothing good ever came from that soil." Other families held on to the story as a grim banner of survival. They passed down tales of great-grandfathers who escaped the Bell property by sheer luck, men who were scheduled for the shed but ran in the middle of the night, risking dogs and bullets. These stories were told in harsh, matter-of-fact voices around kitchen tables. Not to scare children but to warn them. This is what happens when you believe rich men who promise too much. This is what happens when you let your guard down. Occasionally, journalists or graduate students from northern universities would appear in Jefferson County, hoping to write books or theses on the Bells. They'd go door to door asking questions, showing old photographs, holding out tape recorders. Most doors slammed in their faces. Those who did speak gave cautious, clipped answers. One elderly man, whose grandfather had worked for the Bells, told a writer bluntly, "You can write it all down if you want, but it won't change nothing. Folks still find a way to look the other way when money talks. Only difference is they use quieter chains now." In private moments, though, people shared fragments of memory that sounded almost like confessions. A woman recalled how her mother woke up screaming for months after the trials ended, haunted by dreams of men crawling across her bedroom floor with broken wrists, whispering her name. Another man said his uncle never spoke a word after returning from the Bell plantation. He simply sat on the porch every evening, staring at the horizon until the day he died. These small, raw accounts painted a picture more brutal than any court transcript ever could. The shed wasn't just a building. It was a wound that never fully closed, festering beneath polite conversations and Sunday services. Even the land seemed unable to heal. Fields around the old Bell estate often produced thin, sickly crops, though soil tests found nothing wrong. Local farmers said it was the ground itself refusing to forget. Churches tried to offer closure over the decades. Ministers preached sermons on forgiveness, urging families to let go of hate so their souls wouldn't sour. Some descendants attended these services out of habit, nodding at the right moments. But inside, many still clenched their jaws, thinking of how easily local preachers once took Bell money, praising them from the pulpit while men wasted away in a locked shed not half a mile from the church doors. Every few years, a community committee proposed putting up a proper memorial on the Bell property, something that would name the men who died there, honor the ones who survived. But these efforts always faltered. Some locals feared it would attract unwanted attention, dredge up old family connections best left buried. Others argued it was disrespectful to reopen old wounds, conveniently forgetting that for some families those wounds had never closed to begin with. So the Bell estate remained mostly untouched. A place passed by quickly on roads where drivers instinctively sped up, windows rolled tight against whispers that might or might not be real. Hunters still avoided it, muttering about strange movements near the orchard. Children dared each other to steal rusted chain links from the collapsed shed, then often returned them days later, pale and shaking, claiming they heard voices calling their names at night. Meanwhile, small, quiet rituals continued. Some families, usually descendants of the original victims, gathered near the property once a year. They didn't bring preachers or newspaper cameras. They came with plain wreaths, jars of sweet tea to pour out on the ground, and whispered prayers that sounded less like forgiveness and more like a pact to remember. They'd stand there in a loose circle, heads bowed, sometimes reaching down to run fingers across the soil as if trying to touch the hands of those long gone. Not every story was about fear, though. In some houses, elders spoke with pride that their ancestors endured the Bell cruelty and lived to build families, to stand on land they owned themselves. They thought they broke us, one woman said at a small gathering, her voice steady despite tears. But look at us now. We're still here. We remember. And that means they didn't win. Yet even then the Bell shadow loomed large. When elections rolled around, some residents found themselves suspicious of slick-talking men in suits who promised jobs and prosperity, haunted by how similar it sounded to Jonathan Bell offering advances on wages that would never be paid. When land developers came sniffing around Jefferson County in the 1980s, pitching big dreams of hotels and golf courses on cheap acreage, locals turned them away. Part of it was superstition. No one wanted to build luxury resorts on cursed soil. But part was memory. They knew too well what happens when outsiders see only dollar signs and ignore the people who already live there. So Jefferson County stumbled into the modern age carrying an uneasy inheritance. The Bell story survived not just in archives or history books, but in everyday caution, a quiet refusal to trust too quickly, a protective suspicion that lived in glances exchanged across front porches and church aisles. Chapter 6: The Whispered Legacy. By the turn of the 21st century, Jefferson County had changed in nearly every visible way. Roads were paved, new storefronts replaced old wooden facades, and schoolchildren carried smartphones instead of lanterns. But underneath that layer of modern convenience, the shadow of the Bell family lingered, as if embedded in the very foundations of the town. The Bell estate itself was mostly gone. What remained of the mansion finally collapsed under a hurricane that tore through Mississippi in the late 1990s. Locals said it was long overdue, that the house was standing only out of sheer spite, held together by the weight of its secrets. The shed had rotted away decades before, overtaken by vines and insects that consumed every scrap of wood. Only stone footings and rusted metal rings half buried in the dirt gave any clue to where 12 men once knelt, chained and starving. But the place still drew people. Not the developers or plantation revivalists of the 20th century, but a different sort of pilgrim, descendants, curiosity seekers, sometimes even small clusters of local teenagers chasing a thrill. They came on foot or parked at the edge of the old road, sneaking past barbed wire put up mostly as a symbolic barrier, since everyone knew it wasn't to keep anything out, but to keep what was buried there from being disturbed. Those who walked the grounds often reported the same uneasy sensations. Sudden cold on a humid day, the feeling of being watched from behind low tangles of brush, moments when conversation dropped and everyone looked at each other with the unspoken question, "Did you hear that?" A scrape, a whisper, a faint rattle of metal on metal. Most left quickly, muttering excuses about needing to get home before dark. A handful stayed longer, determined to prove the stories were nothing more than old Southern folklore. They took soil samples, scanned the area with metal detectors, tried to reconstruct building layouts from crumbling maps. They rarely returned a second time. Something about the place gnawed at them, even if they couldn't articulate why. Some later admitted in interviews or online posts that they started dreaming about chains, or woke in the middle of the night convinced someone was standing over their bed. Meanwhile, Jefferson County itself tiptoed around the Bell legacy. The high school history curriculum mentioned the Bell plantation only in passing, a footnote under lessons on the broader slave economy. There were no formal monuments, no state-funded plaques. A few private efforts tried to mark the spot, but local committees always stalled them out, citing costs, disagreements over wording, or vague worries about stirring up old grievances. Yet the memory survived in more intimate ways. In certain households, parents still cautioned children not to wander near the old Bell land, warning them that the ground remembers. Grandparents told hushed stories of ancestors who escaped the Bells, or who died chained in that shed, leaving behind bloodlines forever shaped by fear and hard-earned resilience. These weren't ghost stories for fun. They were lessons dressed up in folklore, survival guides disguised as chilling bedtime tales. Churches occasionally wrestled with how to acknowledge the history. Some preachers argued it was best left in God's hands, that continually revisiting the past only stirred bitterness. Others insisted silence was a sin, that forgetting meant the bells won. In small fellowship halls after Sunday services, members debated whether it was appropriate to hold prayer vigils on the bell grounds. Most years, the proposals died out under nervous glances, the sense that some places were simply too heavy with sorrow to trespass with hymnals. Meanwhile, outside eyes kept trying to latch onto the bell story. Television crews pitched reality series episodes. Podcasters drove down hoping to record eerie audio. A streaming documentary company once tried to lease the land for dramatic reenactments. Each time, local landowners or descendants blocked the deals, sometimes fiercely. They weren't protecting the bell's memory, they were safeguarding the pain that still lived in their own families, unwilling to turn it into spectacle for strangers to binge between cups of coffee. Privately, many residents carried small rituals meant to keep whatever haunted the Bell estate at bay. A sprig of sage above a door, a string of river stones along property lines, whispered prayers over newborns to keep them from carrying inherited nightmares. These customs weren't written down or taught in schools. They moved through the county in the form of quiet demonstrations, things children learned by watching elders: how to cross a certain fork in the road without looking down the bell path, how to never take shortcuts across those overgrown fields no matter how tempting it seemed in daylight. In the rare moments someone did break these old codes, consequences seemed to follow. A local teenager once stole one of the rusted chain rings from the Bell Foundation as a dare. Within a week, his dog went missing, windows in his house cracked without cause, and he woke 3 nights in a row to the sound of heavy breathing by his bedroom door. He quietly returned the ring, laying it on the cracked stones where the shed once stood, whispering a choked apology before sprinting back to his truck. His family said the disturbances stopped immediately after. Through all of this, the name Bell remained spoken in certain corners, always soft, never casual. It was a warning, a living proverb about greed, cruelty, and how easily entire communities could be bought into complicity. People reminded each other that the bells didn't start with chains. They started with charm, with money, with donations to churches and schools, with friendly handshakes and smiles that made it easy to look the other way. The chains only came later, when everyone was too entangled to protest without risking their own comfort. And so the Bell story survived, not because it was preserved by historical societies or taught rigorously in classrooms, but because it was carried in the marrow of families who knew exactly what had happened. They passed it down not to keep old grudges alive, but to ensure their children recognized the shape of danger when it came dressed in respectability. The worst evils didn't arrive as snarling beasts. They arrived with polite invitations and promises of prosperity, the same way Jonathan and Eleanor Bell had once built their empire of horror under the Mississippi sun. In time, even the last physical remnants of the Bell estate gave way completely to nature. Heavy storms uprooted the final sections of fence, vines choked what little foundation stones were still visible, and wildlife reclaimed the fields. But locals still avoided the place instinctively. Hunters rerouted their usual trails, farmers left a wide berth when planting new crops, and parents instructed children never to play anywhere near the tangled growth that had swallowed the old shed's ruins. Yet every so often, someone ignored these generations-old warnings. A small group of college students once camped near the site for a thrill, eager to prove the haunting stories were nothing more than folklore. By morning they were gone, tents abandoned, gear left scattered. A search found them 2 miles down a dirt road, walking barefoot and filthy, unable to explain why they'd left in the night. When pressed, one of them started to cry, insisting she heard men calling her name over and over from inside the ground. Her friends never contradicted her. They just stared at the floor, pale and shivering. Local law enforcement learned long ago not to linger at the Bell land. Deputies called out for trespassing complaints arrived in pairs, stayed only long enough to shoo off whoever was there, then left without so much as shining a flashlight on the spot where the shed once stood. Some new officers tried to laugh it off, until their radios cut out unexpectedly or their flashlights flickered and died, leaving them surrounded by the thick hush of old trees and an unshakable feeling of being watched. Most never returned a second time. Meanwhile, the Bell descendants who'd spent their lives hiding from their own last name aged and died quietly in distant cities, their children often unaware of the full truth. Some families did their best to seal that past off completely, burning old documents, shredding letters that mentioned Mississippi. But the Bell story had taken on a life beyond mere records. It lived in the shared memory of Jefferson County, a memory so deeply embedded it felt almost like instinct. Residents who'd grown up hearing cautionary tales didn't need proof to respect the weight of the land. Even the most skeptical townspeople admitted that something about the property felt wrong, as if the ground itself held a grudge. Preachers still included veiled references to sins that stain a community in sermons. Older members of the congregation nodded along solemnly, knowing exactly which sins they meant, even if the Bell name was never spoken from the pulpit. Newcomers to the county sometimes tried to dismiss it all as backward superstition. But after a few years, many found themselves adopting the same quiet habits, avoiding certain roads after dark, refusing to cut across the overgrown fields no matter how much time it would save, and lowering their voices if a story about the Bells threatened to slip into casual conversation. So it was that the Bell family's legacy endured, not in marble monuments or bronze plaques, but in the cautious silence of a county that had learned through brutal experience how quickly neighborly smiles could turn to complicity, and how deep the roots of horror could grow when watered by wealth and fear. Epilogue: What remains? Today, the story of the Bell family is almost never spoken outright in Jefferson County. There are no official plaques marking where the mansion once stood, no tidy historical summary framed on the wall of the local courthouse. Visitors who pass through might never hear the name at all. And yet, if you spend enough time among the older families, if you pay attention to the way conversations stutter and eyes drop to the floor when certain topics come up, you'll realize that the Bell name still lives there, not as a point of pride but as a quiet, enduring scar. In many ways, that's its own kind of monument. The silence is deliberate, a warning etched into the habits of generations. Parents still tell children not to wander too far past certain fence lines, but they don't always explain why. Neighbors still exchange uneasy looks when someone mentions the old Bell Road needing repaving. Even without the rotting shed or the grand house to remind them, the people of Jefferson County carry the story in the way they move through their own land, careful where they step, careful what they revive. Far beyond Mississippi, the Bell name has become little more than a footnote in dusty records or a passing curiosity in the occasional Southern Gothic travel guide. Those who chase such tales often look for the wrong thing. For demons scratching under floorboards, for blood that refuses to wash away, for ghostly figures shackled and weeping beneath the moonlight. But the real horror of the Bells was never supernatural. It was terrifying precisely because it was human, an empire built on cruelty and greed, protected by community silence, polished up by donations and charms so no one had to look too closely at what paid for the wine and fine linens. That's why, for the people who still live there, the memory is more than folklore. It's a lesson about how easily evil can take root in polite society, how smoothly monstrous acts can be hidden behind gracious smiles and generous checks. The Bell family didn't start as monsters. They started as benefactors, as patrons of the church and employers of countless local hands. Their shed didn't begin as a prison. It became one slowly, quietly, while the county averted its gaze in the name of prosperity. And that's the real curse of the Bell estate, not the supposed spirits wandering the old orchard, but the fact that such horror was allowed to grow unchecked because it was easier for everyone to look away. Easier to accept gifts and invitations, easier to swallow gossip with a smile and reassure each other that surely the Bells were good people, surely the whispers were exaggerations. By the time the chains were rattling behind locked doors, by the time men were starving in the dark, it was too late. Everyone's hands were already dirty, stained by years of complicity, by the comfort of believing the pleasant lie over the ugly truth. That's what lingers in Jefferson County. That's why parents still hush their children near the old property line. They're not just afraid of ghost stories, they're afraid of forgetting how quickly decent people can be led into collective guilt. They want their sons and daughters to feel the weight of the place so they'll recognize it if something like it ever starts again, no matter how pretty the front porch looks or how sweetly the invitations arrive. So if you ever find yourself on one of those cracked roads leading through Jefferson County, and you notice that drivers quicken their speed near a certain bend, or that no one builds new homes on that wide stretch of wild, uneven ground, understand that it's not superstition. It's memory. It's caution earned the hardest way possible. It's the whispered truth that the worst monsters never needed claws or fangs. They only needed neighbors too polite, too greedy, or too frightened to ask the right questions. And maybe that's why stories like this still matter. Not because of creaking floorboards or ghostly chains, but because they remind us how horror often comes dressed in silk and silver, with a friendly handshake, asking only that we keep quiet. Maybe that's why people still tune in to hear these tales, to make sure they never forget that what happened to 12 men in a shed on the Bell estate wasn't an accident or a haunting. It was a choice. A series of choices made by ordinary people who convinced themselves it was easier not to see. So if this story left a chill under your skin, let it stay there. Let it serve as your reminder that silence can be as deadly as any chain, and that sometimes the most dangerous ghosts are the truths a community decides to bury. And maybe that's the real lesson left behind by the Bell family, that horror doesn't always haunt us as shadows in the night. Sometimes it hides in broad daylight, smiling politely, shaking hands, asking only that we stay quiet. If this story made you think twice about what's hidden behind closed doors, or wonder what secrets your own town might be willing to ignore, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who thinks these things could never happen close to home, and stay with us. Because the past has a way of echoing into the present, and there are countless more dark truths waiting to be uncovered.